Continuing our verse-by-verse study through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're in 2nd Samuel chapter 3 this morning. 2nd Samuel chapter 3. With our technology not cooperating with it this morning, we can tend to look at that as something that's really not part of the plan, certainly, but it's hardly what we would call, which is the title for today, strife and chaos. It is not chaos when something doesn't go perfectly right, but we tend to operate in a world of chaos because we operate in a world that is different from that the way God would design it to be. And yes, God is creator. He is head over everything, but yet he gives free will choice. And so as people continually, and including us, dear friends, as we act in opposition to, many times, the plans of God, we court strife and chaos. What is strife? Strife is conflict. Strife is conflict. And chaos, of course, is just the opposite of order. Now, I know many people in this room very much think that their lives court order. Can I tell you that you are mistaken about that? And you live in a world that does not court order, not the kind of order that is important. If you have all your wrapped up socks and all of your pairs of shoes lined up perfectly, and they actually are all flat with the wall surface, you think you live a life that is orderly. Or if you actually, as I knew one person individually who did all of their trash cans, he had about 8 or 10. I was friends with his daughter. He had about 8 or 10 of these trash cans, and they were all pointed exactly the right direction. We at times would just go over to the house and just mess with the direction of the trash cans for demented fun. Just to mess with them just a little bit. This was also the same person that all of his canned goods were labeled. If some of you do this, I'm sorry. Labeled, even though every can I know has a label on it as to what it is, but had one of those, what do you call those things even? I'm forgetting the name of it. What's it? The label makers. See? Slap, get it on there. Now I know exactly where that belongs and what it is. Good for you. It's not the kind of order we're talking about today, but the order that God designs. The specific order that we're going to see missing from the chapter today as people kind of operate independently of God. We're here in chapter 3. Of course, we know that even though Saul is dead, the house of Saul still wields power. In fact, the house of Saul is going to dominate the northern tribes of Israel because of certain choices that people make. Yes, David has been made king, and for 7.5 years, roughly, he's been king of Judah and the southern tribes, but not of Israel. Certainly not of Israel as a whole. We're going to see what the circumstances are that surround the decisions that have been made there. You will see both strife, conflict, and chaos that happens as a result of not doing things the way that God had designed them to be. And it was even more obvious because we're going to find that the people involved know all about what God's directives are. It is not ignorance that we're looking at today. We're looking at absolute, pure refusal to do what God told them to do. Basically, not saying, even making a judgment of whether God's plan was a good one or not, but simply leaning completely on our own ability to ascertain what a situation needs. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's not me, that's not what I do, I typically follow after what God says. First of all, I think probably you should be a little bit more honest with yourselves, but this does manifest itself in smaller ways, and when we get used to making decisions or doing things on our own without God, that becomes bigger deals and bigger deals and bigger deals. It may start out with small details, but then it becomes a course that is filled with conflict or strife and chaos. Look at verse 1 of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Again, we just talked about that. Roughly 7.5 years. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. As you remember that Abder had propped up a puppet king. We're going to look at that as well. Popped up a puppet king to take over for the house of Saul, to represent the house of Saul. and David simply ruled the southern kingdoms. Well, in their little civil war that's been going on for over 7 years now, David's house, David's forces continue to gain strength. And the house of Saul and his son, they're not doing so well. Sons were born to David, verse 2, in Hebron. The first was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. That's important to take note of that one in particular, because that one gives a little bit of a reasoning to David why he brings on a bunch of wives. Now, Solomon, we know that Solomon went off the deep end on this one. Solomon had 300 plus wives. He also had 700 concubines. That's a mess. Talk about chaos. And an impossibility to even try to please. I would suggest that even those numbers are much smaller for David. It is impossible to do right by the sons and the wives that he has brought into his life. So consequently, there will be chaos in the family of David. Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17, God predicts that what they will do, what the people of Israel will do once they conquer the land of Canaan, they will turn to him and say, we want a king like all the other nations. Remember, as that happens as 1 Samuel begins. But it's predicted in Deuteronomy chapter 17. God says, this is what you're going to do. And when you do that, let me give you some guidelines about the king that you should have. Not someone who grabs a bunch of horses. Remember, horses and animals in general were a representation of the wealth of a man, of a family. And horses represented the power. And wives represented virility. This is what the kings of the world would do. That's why God is calling a contrast here. So they shouldn't be obsessed with money and shouldn't be obsessed with material possession and shouldn't be obsessed with sexuality and taking of women as if they were property, which was very common in the time. David has a slightly different motivation that we'll look at in a second, but that called to attention something that was absolutely wrong. And David's multiple wives and multiple children, we're going to look as we go through 2 Samuel, those multiple children live lives that are absolutely problematic, to say the least. They are a troublesome crew. And you have to think in large measure, it is because David was not much of a father. Impossible to truly be there for all of his sons and all of his wives. So we continue, verse 4. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, the son of David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. As I said before, what gives us the hint as to David's motivation is when we go back to Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. Now, Geshur was a nation. You could look on a modern-day map of the Middle East, and you can look at the nation of Syria, the southwestern corner, up by the Sea of Galilee, just off to the right of the Sea of Galilee, was where the nation of Geshur was, or Geshur. And what David was basically doing is he isn't necessarily seeking multiple pleasures, as Solomon admits in the scriptures in Ecclesiastes that he lived a life pursuing pleasure as a meaningful reason to live. And he calls it meaningless, if you recall. That to pursue pleasure with your life as a reason for living is meaningless. It's not the right thing to do. David, however, has a slightly different motivation, even though God has said this is not a good thing. And we want here at the end of this for the scriptures to say, and this was a bad choice by David. But that's not what happens. But Deuteronomy 17 makes that clear. God does not approve. What David is doing here, in many cases, he's establishing, because he's fighting a civil war with his own people, he's establishing these little treaties with nations around Israel, that he might have cooperation from these other nations, at the very least, so that they don't attack Israel. And oftentimes in the ancient world, the way that they did this is they would marry off a daughter of a king to another king or to a prince, combining families from nations that had opposing kind of points of view or opposing desires. So that this desire was that they'd have a treaty together, and that they, because they've combined families, that they will respect one another and kind of look out for one another. We're now on the same team now, is the idea. So in a way of kind of pacifying his neighbors, or becoming friends with his neighbors, he actually marries many of their daughters. Now, friends, can I just tell you, in this ancient world, it had some sense to it. It made some logical sense. But I could tell you straight away that God did not approve. And that later, the family of David, we're going to see some of it right here now. But the family of David will be one that is dominated by chaos and conflict. Verse 6, during the war between the house of David and the house of Saul and the house of David, Abder had been strengthened in his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Now, we'll just back up just a little bit here. Remember Ishbosheth, he is the son of Saul. He has no necessarily aspirations for the crown, to sit on the throne, but Abner has propped him up to keep the house of Saul in power. Now you could wonder why he did this. The most obvious reason is Abner's own sense of power. He has been the general of Saul's armies. Saul is now dead. That, by definition, puts him out of a job and out of the authority and power he once enjoyed. So he props up Ishbosheth. Scholars also believe that the house of Saul was still wide and powerful. This is the tribe of Benjamin. That's going to be important in a couple of verses too. And they have a great deal of influence. And Abner probably thought somewhere in his mind that he was doing Israel a favor by continuing to allow the house of Saul to have power so that it wouldn't descend into civil war. Well, ultimately, that's exactly what he has allowed to take place. We'll see that again in the next few verses. Saul had this concubine. Now Saul is dead. A concubine for a dead man is, also out of a job, as horrible as that job might be. But she has no contact. She is no one who is protecting her. She is not someone who is protected like the wives of a king would be protected for the future. They're part of the family. Concubines are not. And in most cases, they would have been kind of jettisoned. But they are still thought of as the possession, at least, of the family. Odd, isn't it? So strange. Ishbosheth is starting to feel his oats. He wants to be the real king of Israel. He's been propped up as the king of the northern tribes, king of the house of Saul. And he never really wanted the job in the first place, but now he's felt power. He's tasted it, and now he wants it. So what is he doing? He's pushing back against the power of Abner. And so what is he doing? He's suggesting that Abner has behaved inappropriately, and that, by definition, will elbow Abner kind of out of the power base and grant him more power. At least this is what he thinks. So he confronts Abner. "Hey, somebody told me you went and slept with one of my father's concubines. Shame on you." He's testing the waters. He's seeing if he can nudge Abner out of the way and grab power for himself. Verse 8, Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said. So he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul, and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." Abner is ticked. This has backfired big time. And it probably means that Abner actually had nothing to do with this. This is a completely made-up deal. Abner is truly offended. Because what this would mean is that Abner is actually looking to be seated in the throne himself. Because he's taking action to take what belonged to Saul. It is a great offense to the house of Saul if this is true. But Abner shouts him down. And it probably means that Abner did not do this. He says, over a woman. He says, really? Over someone who is essentially a property of your father. I would jeopardize all that's going on now? He continues, verse 9, "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. He means from north to south. Ishbosheth did not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. I'd say so. It's fascinating, though, what Abner says here. What does he say? He says, you know what? I'm tired of this. I've been loyal to your family. I have propped you up, you worthless son, and made you a de facto king. You know what? I'm enough of this. I'm going to do what God wanted me to do from the beginning. Abner knows. He knows that the kingdom has been promised to David. Abner, where has this been for 7 years? Think a few less people would have died? A little less conflict among the brothers and sisters of Israel? What a foolish thing. But now he says, I'm tired of propping you up. I'm tired of this mirage that we are playing games in. I have half a mind. In fact, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what God has told us to do from the beginning. And I will turn the rest of Israel over to its rightful king, David. And Ishbosheth knows that he crossed a line. Oops. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves, what does it take for us to do the right thing? Do we have to be shamed into it? Can someone just remind us of what the right thing is to do? Or do we have to see so clearly the calamity that we have caused through our own decision making? Well, Abner's had enough. And the shaming, the accusation, the total grab for power that Ishbosheth did, not even appreciating what Abner has done. Now, what Abner has done is terrible, but Ishbosheth had absolutely no business being part of the kingdom, sitting in the throne, wearing a crown. And it wasn't good enough for him. Well, Abner's serious. Verse 12, Abner sent out messengers on his behalf to David. Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all of Israel over to you. What's interesting is David's response. Good, says David in verse 13. I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. You not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, or Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. Why was she important? Well, she was the first wife of David. The wife that when David ran away to protect himself from Saul, Saul, out of spite, gave her to another man. Now, you wonder about the pride involved in this. You see David revealing a little bit of pride, where he wants her back. I don't know that this is a great deal of love involved, guys, but it is symbolic. He's acting the way that he had before, as he makes treaties based upon who he is marrying into his family. That daughter that Saul took back from me, my first wife, I want her back. It is symbolic of truly surrendering what Saul stole from him. And then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife, Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. Remember, Saul had given him an impossible task. Go and kill 100 Philistines. In fact, David kills 200. So there, he says, to earn the right to have the hand of Michal. So he says, I've earned this. I have earned her hand. So Ishbosheth, in verse 15, gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Boy, imagine having this bio and none other in the scriptures, guys. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. And then Abner said to him, go home. And so he went back. That just puffs up the ego, don't it? You pathetic creature, go home. Okay. And he does. Poor guy. Just want to bring that up. It's not really part of our subject matter today, but I felt bad for the guy. Verse 17, Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, for some time you have wanted to make David your king. Really? The elders of Israel, this is the northern kingdoms, guys. He meets with the elders of the other tribes and says, I know you've wanted this for some time. Abner, where has been your brain? Imagine the chaos, the conflict that has happened as a result of Abner just ignoring the instructions of the Lord. You know, until this time, Abner has a reputation of being a man of integrity. In fact, most scholars believe that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Abner was never happy about the pursuit of David. And you notice that often that Saul is chasing without Abner even being mentioned. And if Abner was with the crew, he probably would be mentioned as the general in charge of all the armies. Abner respected David. He respected Joab, the general of David's army. And you see the conflict that's been created because he refused to do what God wanted him to do. He tells all of the elders that he meets with, he says, "You've wanted this for some time, David is your king," verse 18. "Now do it, for the Lord promised David, by my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." Guess who is losing the war with the Philistines right now? Because they're too busy fighting amongst themselves. 7 years ago, this could have been taken care of. But it hasn't been, because somebody decided that God's order was not important enough for him to follow. Verse 19, Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person, and then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. Why was meeting with the tribe of Benjamin so important? Because the house of Saul was from Benjamin. The Benjamites, they were Benjamites. And so this was probably the hardest sell of all. Go to the Benjamites, to the house of Saul, and say, "Look, this is what's right. Let's do this." And notice how many he convinces. He told David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. Every elder of the tribe of Benjamin said, "Yes, you're right, Abner. We got to do this." Amazing, once the people decided what the right thing was to do, how simple a case it was for Abner to accomplish. Verse 20, when Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. How gracious is David? Here is the enemy general, who basically has capitulated. And he greets him warmly. He prepares a feast, not just in ceremony, but to treat Abner as an important man of Israel. Isn't that amazing? David remains so gracious. Verse 21, Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel." He means all the elders, all of the leadership, "for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. You see David, although he's making some poor decisions in some ways, you can tell that the relationship with God is warm and on his mind at that particular moment. He is focused on honoring Abner. He is focused on achieving for the sake of Israel what's important for Israel. What is important now? That we come back together as brothers and sisters, as one nation under God. Does that sound familiar? That was the idea behind this place, to be one nation under God. David knows that that is what's best for his people, and so he does not waste time with petty squabbles and revenge against Abner. How many people have died? How worthless was this? David doesn't take it out on Abner. Instead, he craves the peace that God wants to deliver them. Just then, probably within minutes, verse 22, David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away and he had gone in peace. Now Joab is the general of David's men, of David's troops. And he has a particular connection to Abner. He knows Abner, he has respected Abner, except they now are on opposite sides of the civil war. And Abner did something to Joab and his family. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner, son of Ner, had gone to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. Verse 24, so Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone." What does he mean? Now I can't seek my revenge. If you remember last chapter, when a battle was raging between the northern tribes, the house of Saul and the house of David, Joab's brother, Asahel, speed demon, the man Flash, he takes off after Abner as Abner is retreating with his men. He wants to kill Abner. And if you recall from the stories, how many times does Abner say, turn away, go back? He finally tells Asahel, at least arm yourself. If I have to kill you, how could I look your brothers in the face? Joab specifically. How can I look him in the face if I have to kill you and you're unarmed? Abner wants no part of killing Asahel, but Asahel is, pardon me, hellbound on, that's awful. Okay, so he wants to kill Abner. And Abner says, at least arm yourself. This is a fair fight. If you recall how Abner kills Asahel with the blunt end of his spear. Didn't even want to kill him. So what is Joab thinking? What's best for Israel? Not at all. He wants revenge. He wants to kill the man who has killed his brother. He says, how could you do this, my king? How could you do this to me? He says. Verse 25, you know Abner, son of Ner, he came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing. You know, Joab has no evidence for this. He just hates the man. And so he wants David to have done something different, to hold him there perhaps, so that Joab could do this. Verse 26, then Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern at Sirah, but David did not know it. Why doesn't David know it? Because Joab knows David never would approve. Verse 27, now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber as if to speak with him privately, and there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. It is interesting when we know full well what is right. And we know full well those that we report to and those who supervise our actions would not approve. And yet we go ahead and do it anyway. And there isn't a person in this room that cannot think of a time when they did just that very thing. Hopefully you didn't do as Joab did and stab somebody in the stomach. Hopefully that's something you skipped. But anytime you do something when you actively know this is wrong, the people who supervise my actions, the people who are mentors in my lives, the people who love me and protect me would never approve of this action, you've stepped into a world of chaos. It's exactly what Joab does here. As he kills Abner, verse 28, later when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Wow. There's a curse of a family. And we know that Joab's family, including Joab, actually will one day pay a heavy price for what he has done here. Verse 30, Joab and his brother Asahel murdered Abner because he had killed their brother, Asahel, pardon me, that's his other brother, his Abishai, pardon me. And he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. Verse 31, then David said to Joab and all the people with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner. King David himself walked behind the bier. This is basically the casket. They participate in this very extravagant funeral for Abner. He's recognized as a hero of the nation. He's treated that way. And in fact, David shows a mourning. He actually commands his men, even Joab, the one who killed him, you will tear your clothes in mourning. You will wear sackcloth and ashes. You will mourn the death of this man because you've done wrong. And then David said to Joab and all the people with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, walk in it in mourning in front of Abner. Verse 32, they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people wept also. He's buried in Hebron because currently that is the de facto capital of Israel, as David lives there. Jerusalem would not be the capital of Israel for some time. It will happen during the reign of David, but David will defeat the Philistines and make that possible. Right now, it is Hebron, and that's why he is buried there. Verse 33, the king sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Clearly, he's saying no. Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked. It was not a death that Abner deserved, is what he's saying. And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets. He's fasting in mourning for Abner. What is he saying? Doing a very smart thing. He's communicating for all of Israel. I had nothing to do with this death. I do not approve of this death, because this had the potential, guys, of leading to even more strife. In fact, civil war continuing, rather than bringing them together as a nation once again. David values what? Himself, revenge, his patience, his own sense of comfort, his own aspirations for the kingdom. No, he values the nation, and he values God's order that God set up. All of the people took note and were pleased, verse 36. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people there and all of Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. So both those that followed after Abner into civil war, and both those that followed David in competition with Abner, heard from David, who would now be king, this was wrong. And let us now come together as a nation once again under God. Then the king said to his men, do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. It's an interesting translation there when it says, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah, meaning Joab and his brothers, it says that they are too strong for me, meaning David says that he does not desire this kind of vitriol in his kingdom. He says that he is much more soft-handed. He assures the people that he's much more soft-handed than that. And that these brothers, Joab and his brothers, they are too severe for me, is what he says. Too severe. You know, it's interesting, guys, when you look at situations within the proper context that they need to be seen in, it often alters your perception of those situations. It's something that people don't seem to be interested in doing anymore. But if Joab had looked at the loss of his brother within the context of the situation that it was in, he probably wouldn't have found any fault with Abner at all. Abner had plenty of things that he did wrong. There's no question about it. He courted chaos throughout this entire experience. But the killing of Asahel, this is not one of his problems, not one of his mistakes. David wants to set a new precedence, that the order that God orders, not just suggests, is the place that we're going to spend our time. It's what we are going to honor in our lives. You have a handout there with titled Strife and Chaos. This is when we reject the wisdom of God. Proverbs 2 verse 6 say, for the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. If you understand that God is the source of truth, and that truth does not come independent of God, truth may come from this world, but it's always going to agree with what God has already set as truth. Otherwise, it's not truth. You will not find a truth independent of God. Proverbs 10:9, he who walks in integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will be found out. Isn't that interesting? He who does in a perverted way, this doesn't mean sexually, it means to take something of its original intent and change its intent for your own purposes. That's to pervert something or someone. If you pervert something as opposed to walking in integrity, that's not going to be done in seclusion. It's not going to be done in the darkness. Eventually you will be found out. And eventually, what Abner did was found out. Proverbs 10:17, he is on the path of life who needs instruction, but he who forsakes reproof goes astray. Friends, we all should be understanding the idea that we should be learning every day of the rest of our lives, especially as we follow Christ. When we feel we've crossed that finish line and don't need to be told what to do anymore. Now, some of us in this room love to tell others what to do. I'm looking at no one in particular. But the problem with loving that idea is that we don't always wait for God's instruction before we instruct. Does that make sense? Just desiring to instruct someone else doesn't mean that you heard that instruction from the Lord. But when you stop listening to God because you think you've got it down, oh, I would never do that, Pastor. When we are ignorant of what he teaches us, that's where that goes. We've heard a little of what God says. I don't need to look at it again. Now I'm going to instruct or I'm going to lead in a guess so kind of mentality. For on the path of life, we need to not just listen to, but to do that instruction that God has for us. Proverbs 16:2 says, all of the ways of man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs the motives. I heard some time ago a politician talking about the danger in this world right now as we judge other people by their most extreme examples and we judge ourselves by the best of our intentions. That is a faulty way of looking at stuff. A faulty way of looking at people. We talked a few weeks ago about there shouldn't be any enemies in our lives. Not at work, not in our neighborhoods, not in our families. There shouldn't be any enemies, and we use that word way too freely. The only enemy that we have is Satan himself, because he wants to derail our relationship with Christ and our ability to spread the good news of the gospel to the people that need to hear it. That is his agenda, and that's why he is our enemy. But we like to think of our own ways being perfectly good and perfectly clean because we judge ourselves. Well, I meant well. Well, good for you. But always when someone is, and I use this example because my mouth is what gets me into trouble, if someone is offended by something I say, it isn't just something, well, they need to get over it. They need to be not so sensitive. If someone has a problem with you or you have a problem with somebody else, fellow Christians, it is your job to fix it in relationship. I just can't deal with that person. They have a problem with me and I don't know what the problem is. Well, how about you go ask them if you value that relationship, and you should. We all see our own ways as being perfectly virtuous, and we judge other people by what the peripheries of what we see. Proverbs 18:1, he who separates himself seeks his own desire. He quarrels against all sound wisdom. Friends, can I tell you, here's a little secret about whether you know, if you know you're starting to wander in your Christian walk, is you stop intentionally spending time with other Christians. You just decide it's not important anymore. Well, I don't like that church, Pastor Will. Then go to another. There are many choices. I can recommend a few. You just can't stand the church you're attending? That darn pastor preaches too long. Got to go to another church. I have some suggestions for you. But you sit at home instead of going to church and being with other Christians. Yes, God bless you. For a time, we went online and we just simply watched our sermons online, and that was all good and fine and better than nothing. But friends, and mainly to our online audience out there, if you are just spending time online listening to sermons, friends, you're missing out on so much. If you intentionally are not spending time with other believers in Christ who can encourage you, that's not good. And that's a great big red warning sign in your life. Proverbs 19:2, also it is not good for a person to be without knowledge, and he who makes haste with his feet errors. This is leaping before you're looking. That's what this is. Makes haste with your feet. If you're in a hurry to do things without first spending a little time on your knees asking what the right thing is to do, you will court chaos. Oh, but I've been to church every Sunday this month. I'm sure I'm making good decisions. Ask him. Proverbs 28:26 says, he who trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoever walks wisely will be delivered. So much of our world today is, well, I feel this. I feel it's the right thing to do. I have the feeling in my heart that this is my calling. I feel in my heart that this is right to divorce my husband. I feel this in my heart that this is a right thing to leave this area. I feel in my heart that it's right to tell my boss off and quit my job. If you trust your own heart as opposed to the heart of God, then you're making a foolish error. Friends, it really depends on how much we either want to live as God wants us to live, or do we really want to court the very chaos and conflict that we are always trying to avoid? May I submit to you, when you have trouble in your life, it is not up to us to find the exit strategy that is somehow listed in God's Word. Because desperately, when we are in painful situations, all we seem to want to do is get out of the pain. May I submit instead is to find the lesson that God wants to teach through the experience. That way you can have the peace that passes all understanding that Philippians talks about. You have peace in the midst of the storm. How come you're so calm? I have no idea. Actually, I do know. It's the Lord himself. Because I don't love my circumstances. Kind of bummed about my circumstances because pain is not happiness. Pain is not joy. Pain is not a great thing. But you know what? You can experience peace and joy in the midst of the most painful experiences of your life. Because you crave the relationship in the order that God promises. We can enjoy that, given as a gift that we do not deserve from God. Or we can continue to kind of run through our life, hitting all the obstacles, hitting all the barriers. It doesn't mean that it's an easier life, but it is a simpler life when you follow Christ. Amen. Let's pray together.